Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the Got Ancient Wisdom live stream. I'm blowing steam out my mouth. Not steam, you know what I mean? It's so cold in this studio that there's vapor coming out of my mouth. Don't think you can see it on the against the bookshelf. So we're probably, we might finish the book tonight. It's possible we're going to finish Total Man this evening. I've started putting the edited chapters up on BitChute and Odyssey. I'm up to chapter 5 at the moment. And and they're taking a bit of time to edit because some of them are 3 hours long, some of the chapters. So I'm just trying to cut out the ands and ums and ers and just leave it as the book. So that and then eventually I'll put it up as a podcast feed somewhere as well, so that people can just listen to the whole book. The flame is pathetically small tonight. I think maybe it's the cold. The wick also snapped off just before I went to light it. So I mean everything's winding down. And I think I might take a because I did inquire about a few interviews, but I still think it might be a bit too early to start getting people on to interview, because I don't want to interview people in front of nobody. I'd prefer if there was a few people tuned in live whilst the interview was happening. But yeah, one Professor Stephen Meathan said he was a bit too busy. We know what that means, really. And a couple of other people still haven't got back to me. There are a few more potential ones that I could get on, but again, I'd rather there was a bit of a bigger audience if I'm going to get some of the people I'm thinking on. But you will enjoy them. They are going to be quality guests, but I'd rather have quality guests in front of a few more people. As much as I love the people that watch now, Ralph and The Only Way Out is In, and occasionally Trevorn, Fremen, a couple of other people, and the people who tune in afterwards, and then Snowy and D2017. But yeah, I think what I'll do is spend, I'll maybe come back in the new year with Personality and Evolution. I want to put together like a trailer for it or something where I can use it to promote the reading and to promote some, tantalizing points in the book. Because it is going to be a barnstormer reading Personality and Evolution. It's dense. It's full of. It's the sophomore album of Stan Gooch, so it's the you put your heart and soul into your first album, second album more experimental, bit more investigating, finding your feet, adding on to what you've done before, but also sort of pushing the envelope a little bit more as well, until we get to the third book, Neanderthal Question, which pushes the envelope as far as right to the edge of the table and over the edge of the table. So Ralph saying we can use Telegram and Gab to push the content. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking like, give me a couple of, because we've only got a couple of weeks until Christmas, so give me a couple of weeks to sort of regroup, and then it's just going to be things like banners and making all of the promo stuff I'm going to need. I also think that my Twitter account might be shadow banned, because I do talk a lot of shit on there, and really I should probably have like a shit like a sort of shit talk account, and then an account for promoting the channel, because I think it's like bad practice to promote, if you want to promote something, to do like also sort of shit talk on the same account, probably even on the same phone. I mean, because I've done that before. I've had different phones for different accounts, and it does sort of build a firewall between you and Twitter's censorship algorithms. Although they although you can check on websites and see whether you're shadow banned. They claim they don't do shadow banning anyway, but they obviously do censor content. I get good good response on replies and retweets, but I don't get literally zero response on original content or on original content or anything to do with the show or anything like that. So I think that my actual original content, my OC, has got some sort of ban on it because I'm only a small account as well. So they hammer small accounts, and especially if you've done, if you do a lot of replies to people who you're not following, I think that's a big one. They flag accounts that reply to people they're not following because you're not being sociable. So you're obviously replying to people that you're not following, which means you're probably shit posting. So I think I've been sort of filtered out, really. So it'll just be a matter of maybe starting another account or something, because I don't know how you undo there is a way of going in and undoing all of the sort of banning stuff. I've tried leaving the account for a few days. That didn't work. So I think the only solution is probably to try and set up, because I've got room for another card in my phone, so maybe I'll get another card, set up a different account on a different card, different phone number, because they've got my phone number for several accounts that I've got. Not to do with anything to do with this stuff, but other work accounts and personal accounts and things like that. And I get good feedback on those other accounts, so I know that it's not the quality of the content. The quality of my content's good. I know I'm good at making content, but I think it's just on this one account. So anyway, the point is that before I start promoting the live read, I'll probably change it to live read rather than a live stream as well. It's not really a stream, it's a read. So when the live read of Personality and Evolution, I'm going to probably start a new Twitter account, get all the promo stuff ready, so banners and ads and trailer and whatever else I need, titling, style and all the rest of it. And then so I'll be back after Christmas, so we can start the new year with a new book. New year, new book. Okay, but with that said, let's get the rest of this chapter done. Right, so we got to, there were some absolute corkers in the last episode that I cut out and re-put up on the internet in places. Again, didn't get any feedback on them. And Telegram as well, Ralph. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's another one. And you said, did I get hit by the storm? Sort of. We felt the storm in the south, but I was indoors, so didn't really make much difference. And then when I was on my way home last night, I just saw it had been snowing in a few places on the way home. And then going to work was just absolutely freezing today. Right, so we got to I'm going to go again from Timothy Leary's The Politics of Ecstasy. So that was towards the end of the last section we read. So we was talking about art, morality and justice, And this is a sort of final chapter, really. This is the final chapter before the conclusion. But this is essentially about the possible future of System A and System B, and the unifying of the two into a new place of System C, which is reason, essentially. So if you take these two, it's about finding a position that neither of the other two are able to fulfill on their own, but the two together, when held in balance, can create a third space. In 1984, there's a concept in 1984 about that they say that about holding two opposing thoughts in your head at the same time. So Orwell didn't think really that System C was a thing. He didn't think it was possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. And it certainly, let me just turn this phone down. Hold on. And it certainly wasn't. It wasn't easy for even someone like Jesus Christ to be able to transcend the two different positions, of the temptation in the desert and being himself. Even Jesus, even if you look at the Bible in that way, even Jesus struggled to find that third place. So it's not easy. And some people are probably better endowed to get to it, or to be able to hit that spot most of the time. But it's something that everybody should be trying to attain. And if it was possible for everybody to attain that ability to be able to hold those two opposing thoughts in your head without reacting to either of them, then you can find that third space, and then we wouldn't have to rely on each other as the replacement for each of those spaces, or to create the opposition that we need in order to react. So where you get your Hegelian dialect of the problem, reaction, and solution. So the third place comes from the problem and the reaction. So that's from like one person creating a problem, you need another person to react to it, and then you get a solution. I know the only way out is into this sort of stuff as well. The only way out is saying, with training and mind purification, with equanimity, one can find the objective self that does it. I do it. Yeah. So equanimity is that balance, finding that balance. And moving into a third space that isn't possible with just the reaction and the problem. So, all versions of the radical movement, and in particular the socialist movement, operate under the delusion that they are new. In fact, as we have shown, their basis is extremely ancient, predating the rise to dominance of System A. One clue, perhaps, is in the word radical itself. It is taken from Latin radix, meaning a root. These movements, then, derive their impetus from the roots or origins of the personality. The official view, however, is that radical somehow means progressive. A better description would actually be regressive, for this, in personality terms, is what is involved. Certainly, the slogan, expansion of consciousness, the cry of the hallucinogenic division of the radical, the people's army, means the admission of the unconscious into consciousness. To this event as such, one has, of course, no objection, unless the intention then is to allow these aspects of the personality to dominate waking consciousness. This, alas, turns out to be what is meant. Thus, there is no real merging of the unconscious and conscious potential, which could lead to genuine liberation. That is, to the emergence of System C. The students of Essex University upset the tables and scattered the papers of the official commission sent to investigate them with the shout of, "You are irrelevant." These are heartening words in themselves, for indeed the establishment society as it is at present constituted is probably irrelevant to the future as such, and the future of our species in the long term. Equally irrelevant in this connection are, however, the views of the left. It would seem to be politics as such which are irrelevant. There is no point in replacing the tedium and the half-truths of the right with the half-truths and tedium of the left. In a recent interview, Michael Foot said that he did not believe that people want to live grabbing and fighting and competing with each other. Conservative spokesmen, for their part, are frequently heard to say that they do not believe that people want to be cosseted and coddled and made into milksops, but want a chance to show what they can do. These men of the left and right appear genuinely incapable of understanding each other. The present author, without wishing to appear to set up in business as Superman, is himself perfectly able to understand both points of view. While certainly the more peaceable and other-oriented nature of the left is in itself most welcome in our present society, one is unable to support the belief that a viable society can emerge on the sole basis of System B1. At this point, we must change tack and once again raise the matter of consciousness. It will, however, be necessary first to attempt some further justification and explanation of this term. 5. It seems to me that the problem of the nature of consciousness, above all else, should be occupying the attention of mankind. This one, must repeat, is very much a minority view amongst psychologists. The academic or experimental psychologist particularly is adamant in the view that if we avoid looking at this matter long enough, it will go away. Consciousness is, he generally maintains, a product of our fantasy or of loose semantics. At best, an unfortunate label surviving from the past for something much more tangible and less mysterious, though he omits to say exactly what. And yet, without consciousness and awareness, the fact of awareness, that is, not the concept, how could there be anything at all of what we term the life experience? The world, while it may in some way exist in our absence, exists in our presence only because we are aware that it exists, just as we ourselves exist only in that we are aware that we do. This last statement would perhaps not be challenged as such by the experimentalist. He, however, by no means wrongly asked the question, how do we become aware? The answer, his answer, is by means of the senses, by the use of external receptors such as our eyes, ears, touch, and so on. As we well know, a man without eyes not only does not see, but is not aware of light. Therefore, the experimental psychologist is extremely concerned to study the eye and its mechanisms and how it functions, relating both to the eye's past experience of stimulation or particular kinds of present stimulation and so on. Nor, I reiterate, is this task in any sense a misguided or pointless undertaking. Let us, however, ask two questions. First, what of the depot or receiving station to which the signals from the various receptors are passed? Does this depot in any way differ from the receptors themselves, or is it simply an extension of them, the other end of the bundles of nerve fibres, whose functions, incidentally, are well understood? The answer appears to be yes, the depot is very different. For at some stage, however, these signals pass into awareness. We, at that point, have a conscious experience. As far as we can tell, what we call a conscious experience can only occur in the central depot. The eye, the ear, the skin, none of these organs have this property. Thus, if a nerve ending is stimulated so that a message, detectable with electronic apparatus, starts on its path to the central depot, but at the same time an electronic or other block is introduced at some point along the path, even quite close to the terminus point, the message is not delivered and we feel nothing. Although the skin or whatever has registered and transmitted a message, we do not experience that fact. This was our first question. The second is more crucial. What on earth does a psychologist mean when he says, for example, that he is studying the mechanism of the eye? Who is studying the mechanism of the eye? The position is yet worse if the psychologist says that at college he made the decision to concentrate on eye mechanisms. What business does he have using these terms? Is not a conscious decision in strict psychological terms a non-event involving a non-existent attribute of the nervous system? Is the fact of the matter actually that the psychologist uses one frame of reference as a living person and another, ludicrously inadequate frame of reference as a psychologist? One finds oneself somewhat, though in fact more so, in the situation of the hero in H.G. Wells's Country of the Blind. This seeing man is unable to explain what seeing is to the people of that country who are all born blind. The present situation, where one tries to explain or define consciousness to the psychologist, is far worse and diabolically so. For the psychologist, while stating that he does not know what is being discussed, is only pretending to be blind. He in fact knows perfectly well what awareness is. It is as much a fact of his experience as anyone else's. At worst, then, he is denying what he knows to be true. At best, without realising it, he puts on a pair of blinkers along with his psychologist's hat. These are harsh words in a professional context. It is not actually inevitable that the matter be approached in this head-on argumentative manner. The objections may be outflanked, perhaps, by allowing consciousness to stand as a hypothetical construct to see whether thereby any closer understanding of any objective event or events is achieved. Such an outcome tends to back-justify one's original assumption. Let us then see whether any aspect of the behaviour of consciousness may be described such that, because the behaviour is seen to exist, one may be encouraged to believe that consciousness itself exists. The present book has proposed that consciousness is a movable commodity. This notion was broached in connection with the journey in Chapter 8. Let us, for the moment, tentatively describe consciousness as a state of arousal of an area of a level of the cortex, or of course extra cortex or subcortex. And let us postulate that this state of arousal tends to occur most often in connection with evolving or recently evolved parts of the nervous system, and less often in connection with parts of the nervous system where evolution, to all intents and purposes, appears to have ceased. We do know, of course, that certain types of electrical activity are displayed by the cortex when an individual is observably conscious, which are not in evidence when he is observably not conscious. One would not, however, wish necessarily to say that this electrical activity is consciousness, though it certainly appears to be a physiological accompaniment of that condition. If one can show that such electrical activity at any time moves its location, and even if the electrical activity at the new site is not identical with the electrical activity at the first site, at a time when a marked change is observed or reported in the subject's inner psychological state, one has a tentative case for the statement that consciousness has moved. When a person ceases to perform a cognitive task, which produces a known pattern of electrical cortical activity, closes his eyes and allows his mind to drift, or specifically begins to daydream, a new electrical activity is observed from the back of the brain, the occipital region, the so-called alpha rhythms. Of course, one swallow does not make a summer. One sees, however, that the beginnings of a case already exist. If consciousness is associated principally with the most recently developed part of the brain, let us incidentally not forget that the cerebellum has undergone considerable recent evolutionary development along with the cerebral cortex. Then one looks to find consciousness more connected with the surface of the cortex than with the subcortex. The sites for the archetypes of the ego would probably prove to be embedded within the cortex and not at the surface of the cortex. While the present book has not gone into that issue in order to not to overcomplicate the discussion, there are recognizable layers in the cortex. In other words, there is a thickness and an interior of the cortex, as well as a surface and a surface area. Ignoring for the moment the question of a physiological site for System C on the basis of our present theories, we would expect most consciousness, whatever that means, to be in operation when System C is functioning. Rather less consciousness to be involved when System A is operating, and System B to involve least consciousness. Of course, in many ways, System A is still a going concern, with System C, as it were, still to some extent only the claimant or pretender to the throne. The latter part of the hypothesis is perhaps seen to be borne out in the elusiveness or dimness of most dreams, and by the fact that dreaming time is normally some 11% of waking time. As to the actual site of System C, one is inclined, for a variety of reasons, to think of parts of the frontal lobes. A piece of evidence of somewhat bizarre antecedents supporting this view is offered at the close of this chapter. On the other hand, System C might involve the whole of the cortex, perhaps the silent areas in particular. This would then allow System A to be sited rather closer to the motor cortex concerned with actual doing. The notion of the movement of consciousness helps in understanding a well-known and widespread phenomenon, and in turn itself receives support as an idea from the existence of this phenomenon. It is suggested that the idea of the migration of souls of the soul ascending to heaven after death, of the belief of many mystics that their souls can pass out of their body during sleep and trance and travel to other places. Indeed, the very notion of the soul as such may arise from the fact of a moving consciousness. This movement would then be itself an archistructure, not an archetype. That is, an unconsciously perceived or experienced property of the nervous system, manifesting itself as a basic ingredient or element of legend, religion, or whatever. While one must reluctantly forego here a general discussion of what the mystic considers consciousness to be, one or two aspects of the occult are of great relevance. The first of these is automatic writing. Automatic writing is a phenomenon which anyone can experience without too much difficulty. What happens as an end product is that one's hand, provided with a pen or pencil, writes of its own accord. Anyone prepared to spend a few minutes each day sitting relaxed in a preferably darkened and silent room, with one hand resting on a writing pad on the arm of a chair or on a low table, as long as one is comfortable and relaxed, holding a pencil, will find that his hand twitches occasionally of its own accord. It is necessary to avoid thinking about the hand, which does not mean that one need be wholly unaware of it. One should, above all, not be trying to make the hand do anything. In time, perhaps even on the first occasion, one's hand will scribble meaningless patterns on the paper. In further time, it will write actual words. As an end product, one can have long, in fact rather endless and rambling, conversations with one's own hand. Many would find the mere prospect, let alone the actual experience of automatic writing, rather unnerving. No doubt, imagining that they were becoming, or at least running the risk of becoming, insane. It is precisely this kind of fear, of course, which causes System A so totally to deny System B. As far as my present theories are concerned, during automatic writing, one allows System B to function robotically, i.e. without consciousness being transferred to System B, and to use an aspect of conscious motor control usually reserved for and by System A, especially during waking consciousness. Automatic writing may be thought of as the first stage of the full mediumistic trance, as demonstrated in the spiritualist medium. This full trance condition requires for its achievement a rather great willingness to allow events to take their course than the majority of individuals in our society are probably able to bring to the situation. When I myself experienced the full mediumistic trance for the first time, the subjective concomitants were, in this order, a wind rushing through the head, a sense of being engulfed by something, with awareness dwindling rapidly to a pinpoint, followed by unconsciousness. The onset of the condition was very sudden, given the impression of some damning barrier having been broken through. I was reminded in retrospect of the accounts of being filled with the Holy Ghost, and of similar narrated experiences in the Old and New Testaments. The second and subsequent occasion of entrancement were less dramatic and without loss of consciousness. The state of mediumistic trance, from one's own subjective point of view, can only be described as a state of possession. The sensation is absolutely literally as if some other person had entered one's body and were using it entirely for his or her own purposes. Someone else walks about the room, talks with other people, using one's own body. One hears oneself speak with the voice of a child or of a girl, quite naturally and unmistakably, with no trace of falsetto. Somehow one has raised a devil, a series of devils, out of one's own personality. This condition can be seen as a logical extension in extreme form of the position on view in automatic writing. There, one proposes, a robotic System B has taken over one small portion of the conscious nervous system and is using it for its own purposes. In the full mediumistic trance, System B has robotically taken over certainly the whole of the conscious motor system, perhaps indeed the whole of System A, for the personalities that arise in the medium are very capable not only of action, but of thinking for themselves. Where, in the meantime, is one's own consciousness? Somehow or other, and certainly, subjectively, it appears to have withdrawn from the scene of operations, out of the way. One suggests that it has perhaps withdrawn completely into System C, the silent association or areas of the cortex, leaving System A vacant, the motor and immediate adjacent areas of cortex, perhaps, for their temporary occupation by the self or System B. It will be clear, therefore, that there is no suggestion that the medium is possessed by the spirit of the dead. That the spiritualist should believe this is, however, perfectly understandable, for such is the most obvious explanation. The subjective experience of possession readily leads to the conclusion that an agency has taken one over from the outside. The fact of the matter seems to be that an agency has taken over from within, though because the possession arises in System B, it is, in that sense, outside System A, while nevertheless still inside the total person. The fact that the medium in trance acquires information telepathically about others present also helps to support the notion of a voice from beyond. So also does the fact that the medium may utter sentences in a language that he or she ostensibly does not know. One says ostensibly because it is obviously not always easy to know how much experience of such a thing as a foreign language a person may or may not have had during his life. Experiments have shown that the nervous system is capable of retaining very large amounts of information that the subject is not consciously aware of having ever heard. So just looking at the chat, sorry. Yeah, Ralph, you're going to give automatic writing a go. Yeah, I think everyone listening should give automatic writing a go. And then, yeah, I mean, we'll get into it in the double helix of the mind. It's like book number 5 or something. There is a list at the end of stuff that you can do to try and, you know, shake your System B awake and try and get more in contact with it. I think automatic writing's in there, but there's lots of things in there. Going out and just going for a walk in nature is a good way of opening up System B, because you're getting away from all of the other stuff. And the only way out is in. Used to do automatic writing every day as part of the Artist's Way book practice sessions called the Morning Papers. Oh yeah, that's it. So before leaving the question of consciousness, 3 further points may be mentioned. Oh, this is part 6, sorry, 6. Before leaving the question of consciousness, 3 further points may be mentioned. First, an analogy by means of which the suggested move-in action of consciousness may be grasped without mystification. If one has a room containing a variety of lighting systems, say concealed lighting along one wall, a central chandelier and a small lamp on a low table hidden by a settee, one may light that room by any of the devices mentioned. Each, however, will give the room a different character and be respectively more suitable for particular occasions. One knows from one's own experience that lighting can create or dispel shadows or give prominence to certain areas of a room at the sacrifice of yet others. Nonetheless, it is of course always the same room. Not only that, but the various lamps each operate from the same source of current and on the same general principles. If the room is thought of as the nervous system or the total physiological personality and the lights as consciousness, one can appreciate that the schema of personality functioning proposed needs contain no element of mysticism. The second point concerns the puzzle of why the narrowly experimental psychologist, especially in view of his general keenness to reify the non-existent, should so steadfastly seek to destroy the notion of consciousness. This puzzle is perhaps best solved by the fact of the movement of consciousness of which, if true, we are all at some level aware. The safest way of avoiding the whole question of the movement of consciousness into the so-called unconscious is by denying the very existence of consciousness in the first place, in something perhaps of the way that the murderer might feel it safer to deny ever having been to the place where a crime occurred, other than to say that he was there but engaged in something else. The outright denial of the unconscious as such, which we have noted at many points, is in fact then only the experimental psychologist's second line of defence. Third of our 3 points is the very vexed question of whether, since it can move within the nervous system, consciousness can move outside the physical personality. Can it exist, as it were, anywhere except in the presence of the physical brain and in association with it? One has no answer at present to this question, but the book suggests that one should be prepared to retain an open mind to the problem. It is undoubtedly the most controversial topic in the whole study of organisms and behaviour. The phenomena of telepathy, amongst other matters, suggests that the solution to the problem is not likely to be a simple one. 7. The remaining points are either final summaries of positions taken up elsewhere, or they are additional points which it proved difficult to accommodate in the argument, as it is in fact developed. As it in fact developed. First, in figure 28, a summary diagram is found of the male and female personalities in terms of the triads discussed in this chapter. Just find them. One second, everybody. Sorry. Just load up the rest of the slides. Hold on. Figure 28. Let's try that. Why no like? Okay. I'm going to have to find these. 1 second. I've definitely got them. We're right at the end of the book. I don't want to not have the final couple of slides in there. Right. Let's get rid of all them. I'm just going to add some more files in. So it is that one to that one. Okay, that should be it. Good. So, first, in figure 28, a summary diagram is found of the male and female personalities in terms of the triads discussed in this chapter. The overall impression obtained from this first part of the figure is that nature in the organism appears to work in terms of pairs of antagonistic functions, which when in harmony yield, in fact, a third situation not expressed by either opposite. In this section of the figure, capital and small letters indicate the greater and lesser strengths of the component. In order not to complicate these diagrams overmuch, the probable connection between capital B2 and capital A is not included in the main figure. If capital A did evolve principally out of capital B2, with which the male is more endowed, this would neatly account for the apparently greater capacity for logical thought in men over women. A further brief word on the connection between musculature, aggression in that sense, and cognitive thought is added later in this chapter. Figure 29 will be seen first not to differ in essential principles from the pyramidal structures of figure 28. Although appearing rather different at first glance, this second figure is a composite of the two parts of the earlier figure 26 of chapter 12 with the addition of System C. It would be neater and perhaps therefore initially more convincing if we could place B2 ahead of capital B2 ahead of capital B1 in the lowest level of the figure. However, the evidence is that, for instance, the forepart of the hypothalamus is concerned with quiescence and the rear with arousal. Nevertheless, such a crossing over of influence from point of origin to point of effect is actually a commonplace of the nervous system as a whole, seen at its most striking in the crossing of the nerve fibres from the right side of the body to reach the opposite left-hand cerebral hemisphere. Further reference will be made to the second part of the latter figure. For the moment, we turn back to the pyramidal modes, the pyramidal models of A. The plus and minus signs at the foot of the figure appear to be new, but actually they are not. It will be recalled that I drew attention to the fact in chapter 3 that aggression contained both fight and flight. These are the positive and negative poles of that particular behaviour. It may also be recalled that we found two opposites for the word love or trust, namely hate and fear. The wider dimensions of these two, as it were, nuclear concepts are shown below. For the moment, let us say that the true opposite of love is hate, whilst fear is more properly a sensation generated not from a state of anti-love, but from the state of readiness for flight. Very briefly, the position the position is this, as on screen. When one thinks about it carefully, one realizes that although aggression is in fact often accompanied by hate, it need not be. Let us consider the case of a farmer who, during a time of food shortage, following the passage of a war across the countryside, calmly, dispassionately, even with pity, shoots the man he finds in his barn, knowing that there is no food to spare for strangers. Or the case of the psychopath who kills a man in order to steal his car, as we might remove a pile of books from a chair in order to sit on it, and with as much emotion. Instances of hate without aggression are also not impossible to come by. A miser may hate people who have more money than himself or who waste money, without the notion of wanting to perform aggressive acts against them. It is perfectly possible, too, for a physical coward or a woman to hate very intensely, but nonetheless passively. One is not trying to play with words here, and it is certainly true that psychologists, psychoanalysts in particular, do sometimes speak, far too loosely in my opinion, of the aggression of the miser and so forth. This usage arises partly from their predetermined view of personality, i.e. that the opposite of what is on view is always at work down below, briefly discussed in the footnote on page 516. The concept of and the word aggression might usefully be reserved exclusively for the physical act of attack or for the obvious surrogate of such attack, and some other word such as resentment or rejection be employed in respect of what are essentially states of shutting out. The view that hate and aggression may not be directly and in that sense not very strongly connected leads to some interesting considerations. One would like, however, to repeat at this point the warning that it is an error to think of aspects of the personality as existing in watertight compartments. There are what we might call centres or nuclei in respect of certain activities, but these always relate, as it were, at the edges to other centres, which they affect and are affected by. In brief, it is possible to envisage a structure of personality still essentially pyramidal, where however, capital B2 is not a major component of system B. Hitherto, we have considered it as part of that system. The alternative model would be somewhat as follows. This alternative arrangement has much to recommend it. If fear or anxiety arises exclusively in connection with flight, the negative pole of aggression, this would account for the close relationship of anxiety with the ego, noted and commented on by Freud. It would also explain, for instance, why we find it difficult or inappropriate to apply the word coward to women. The self, one could say, does not know cowardice, while the ego does. Hence, saints and martyrs go to their awful death with more composure than many heroes, while the ego gives itself medals for bravery, which would make no sense if bravery were a matter of course. Bearing these alternative proposals for the structure of personality in mind, let us consider what we have termed centres or nuclei of behaviour. These are seen as starting points from which quite wide and ramified conceptual structures emanate or irradiate throughout consciousness, becoming very difficult in that process, but still becoming very different in that process, but still possessing on closer inspection a certain basal reference in common. In the course of writing this, I attempted to assign further actual words to the positive and negative poles of capital B1 and capital B2. The results of this attempt follow in no particular order. It will be clear that one is tapping some of the most basic aspects of our emotional life. As always, these lists are in no sense exhaustive. As always, these lists are in no sense exhaustive. It is a sad testimony to my, and perhaps others' psychological makeup, however, that words connected with aggression occurred to me more readily, hence they are here in the majority. What one suggests in connection with the above is that if these various states described by the groups of words in question could, physiologically, be tracked down or back, they would be found to emanate from a single point or area of the nervous system and not from as many points, for example, as there are words. One hesitates to say it, but many of the terms of B1, plus and minus, appear to have a great deal in common with bowel movements. Freud, of course, proposed this long ago and pointed out that, for instance, mean people tend to suffer from constipation, hence the whole concept of anal retention in Freudian psychology. Others of the words of the B1 list have also equally clear associations with eating and hunger. One of the tests of the validity of this thinking is perhaps to examine whether or not we as a culture have produced stock figures, in a sense archetypes, on these bases. Figures who sum up the areas under discussion. One then comes up with B1 positive is the saint, B1 negative is the miser, and B2 positive is the warrior, and B2 negative is the coward. It would be an extremely interesting exercise to take all the nouns of the English language. I'm tired. It would be an extremely interesting exercise to take all the nouns of the English language referring to emotions or attitudes and arrange them into groups on a common sense basis to see how many nuclear starting points one ended up with. Possibly such an exercise could tell us most of what we require to know about the basic structure of personality. There follows next in Table 13 a summary of the attributes of the three major systems A, B and C. The intention is here mainly to remind the reader of the main areas covered and the main conclusions reached. Some of the emotions and mental states associated with our three major personality systems are, and then we have self, ego and person, and a list of mental states and emotions for each of those. Hero figures associated with the self. Snowy's joined the chat. Hello, Snowy. Hello, yeah. So hero figures associated with the self are Christ, Buddha, the martyrs, etc. With the ego, all warriors, warrior kings and rulers. And the overall styles of the self and the ego respectively are being and doing. In the system B society, being replaces doing as far as possible. So, for instance, the emphasis on meditation and withdrawal, both metaphorically and literally, e.g. into monasteries, or dropping out, the withdrawal from the world of activity and striving. In the system A society, doing replaces being as far as possible. Thus, instead of relaxing, one takes a tranquilizer. For sleep, one takes a sleeping pill. In the system A society, the deed is taken for the wish. This appears, incidentally, to be Krishnamurti's distinction between experience and experiencing. Thought is evolved muscle. Emotion is evolved viscera. Some of the historical and archetypal figures mentioned have come close to being the whole man, as we see below. True System C man does not, perhaps, as yet exist. This appears to be the Superman of whom Nietzsche was speaking. We associate him, however, with the totality of life. His being alive is, or will be, fuller and richer. Christ, for instance, said, "I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly." The overall style of System C is therefore life or living. Christ, though essentially a self-figure, was close to the ego, just as a benevolent ruler, though an embodiment of ego, may be close to the self. One may conceptualize the position thus. In earlier chapters, I have spoken of the radical differences in the personalities of man and woman and the activities for which they are and are not ideally suited. The figure which follows, looking somewhat like the opening of a Hollywood film of a former era, attempts to summarize the position. However, the figure makes no claim at all to be exhaustive, nor is it to be taken this time as a literal model of the nervous system. That's figure 30. The gap on the left-hand side of the figure, where witchcraft has been tentatively indicated, awaits the as yet unrealised talents of women. Hopefully and presumably these activities will embrace such matters as telepathy and precognition. Our society desperately needs to find a way back to System B, not in order to revive the dominance of the self, as little to be desired as the dominance of the ego, but in order to make a balanced integration of the two systems possible. It is likely that the present dramatic increase in drug taking of all kinds is a rather desperate attempt on the part of many individuals in our society to find that way back. A very interesting point is that it is precisely in America, the stronghold of System A, that the swing towards System B is most marked, a point which, in his own terms, Charles Reich makes in The Greening of America. Drug taking and living for kicks are perhaps the only slightly less desperate attempts of the normal individual to achieve what Lang sees some of his hospitalised patients as trying to achieve. We end on a speculative note. Gods, we have said, are frequently found to have feet of clay. The son of the earth lost his strength when Hercules raised him from the ground, and Icarus, too, met with disaster when he severed his connections with terra firma. The sign of the Labyrinth, the underground system of pathways found inlaid in the floors of some medieval cathedrals, is a further description of the same situation, the same continuum, i.e. that man is composed of earth at one end and stars at the other, and that we attempt to sever the connection at our peril. The labyrinth, built below ground, the pyramid, squat, compact, windowless, and the cathedral, tall, soaring, the light blazing through its windows, together make an archistructure of man. Where's that? Hang on. Oh my God, it hasn't imported in. Do you know what? This is the very last. I've got to get this one because it's the very last image in the book. Slides. Why? Maybe it only loads a certain number of slides in. I don't know. There you go. Let's just read that again. The labyrinth, built below ground, the pyramid, squat, compact and windowless, and the cathedral, tall, soaring, the light blazing through its great windows, together make an archistructure of man. This last figure should be compared with figure 29, from which it does not essentially differ, as with the human brain, which it symbolically represents. So that's the end of that chapter. Do you have your phone on your book? It looked... Snowy's asking, do you have your phone on your book? It looked like that movement to me. My phone on my book. Do you mean... No, I've got this. That's a bookmark, a leather bookmark that was made by The Only Way Out Is In. And then who else? What else are we saying? The Only Way Out Is In. System A is too insanely high effort for me as a spiritual System B-ish girl. And feminism has made it worse for girls, not better. Yes, because we're not meant to be pursuing feminism. Women are meant to be pursuing the paranormal. So anyway, we're going to do the conclusion now, which is just, we've got a couple of minutes, so it's just a couple of pages. I mean, it's actually, yeah, it's only a couple of pages. Let me just load up one last slide as well. Slides, conclusion. Okay. So, this is the conclusion. A question put by an academic referee who read this book at the manuscript stage was, did I feel that I had said all there was to say about the personality? At various points in the text, and now again below, I've tried to indicate the developing nature of my proposals. These closing remarks which follow are intended to meet a few of the criticisms and possible misunderstandings which this book may produce. Every theory in every line of inquiry is provisional. There are no exceptions to this statement. The apparently unshakable Newtonian explanation of the universe proved to be provisional. Einstein's views will suffer the same fate. The turnover in theories of psychology, however, is still more rapid. This does not imply this time a criticism of the psychologist. It simply shows the occupational risk. The turnover arises, amongst other things, from the complex and peculiarly nebulous nature of psychological material, and not least from our own inevitable involvements with it. The personality is, in some ways, like the half-mythical animals of which hunters bring back reports, but which always evade capture or final identification, or the angel with whom Jacob wrestled, but who, nevertheless, always escapes before daybreak. There is this to add, however. Each time we wrestle with the angel, we discover something new about him. Each successive time we meet him, we fight a little longer and a little more surely. One of the tests of the validity of a theory of personality, apart from its ability to help us understand certain phenomena, is the quantity of data which it succeeds in handling. The theory I've proposed here may fairly claim to handle a considerable amount. Nevertheless, I am well aware of the theory's inadequacies and the difficulties which arise from its internal structure, quite aside from the matter of its external validity. In Chapter 12, for example, I briefly touched upon the question of possible differences between the male and female ego, and between the male and female self. Of course, it is not simply a matter of inventing plausible or plausible-sounding terms. We can all do that till the cows come home. It is a matter of requiring terms to account for observed and described behavioural phenomena. The remark was made at one point that philosophers collect explanations for which they have no facts. This is another of the professional hazards which face those who undertake to study the human psyche from whatever standpoint. I am not as yet, in fact, sure, by way of example, whether the division into male and female ego, the male and female self, is wholly justified. I hope that, in particular, the previous chapter has further suggested the developing nature of some of my views. There, I propose, for example, that there may be a greater disunity between B1 and B2 substructures than I have in general suggested. Since completing the book, I have in fact become increasingly drawn to the idea of 4 poles, 2 sets of positive and negative terminals to the basic emotional battery. Love plus, hate minus, and fight plus, and flight minus. These would then constitute the poles of the self and the poles of the ego, respectively. These poles may be arranged on the perimeter of a circle like the points of a compass. One then has something very reminiscent of some of Jung's basic representations of the personality. Matters need not be left there, for archetypal figures, which correspond to the 4 personality poles as suggested in the previous chapter, are perhaps the saint, the miser, the warrior, and the coward. Let us take these and attempt on a purely chance-your-arm basis to add the dimension of sexuality. This produces saint, lover, miser, virgin, warrior, rapist, coward, masochist. Then let us add the further dimension of male and female, again on a purely rough and ready, undefined basis. This gives us female saint, courtesan, male saint, libertine, female miser, spinster, male miser, a voyeur, Brunheld, dominant or butch lover, Hector, dominant, masculine lover, female coward or harpy, and male coward, torturer. One sees then that other kinds of models of the personality are possible. This one, on which we have here made a tentative beginning, resembles more a child's house of building blocks. Some would feel perhaps that it has about as much value, but suppose we said that each of these figures might be the perceived or personified mean of certain inherited characteristics normally distributed in the population. That would be somewhat less literary, if that were the aim. Are we then, with this latest draft model, suggesting that the general theory of this book, which one has argued out in such detail, is really after all to be scrapped? Not at all, for we note that the square is the basis of a pyramid, just as the circle on which the compass points are arranged is the base of a cone, and that finally the vertical section both of the pyramid and the cone are triads, or at least triangles. I believe, indeed, very much that with such manipulations of the geometric shapes in question, plus the additional symbolics of the positive and negative terminals of the electrical battery and the magnetic poles of the geographic compass, one comes very close to the real structure and functioning of the human personality. Perhaps this is an appropriate moment to apologise to the experimental psychologist. I have been described by one, in other respects generous critics, as something of a crank in my attitude to experimental psychology. I was distressed to hear this view, for while it is true I have made and do make no secret of my disapproval of some aspects of the experimentalist approach, my comments on it have not been intended as a destructive criticism in quite that sweeping sense. I would rest my defence not simply on the fact that I have quoted extensively from the writing of experimentalists, but on the fact that I have been at pains to suggest throughout how my own theories could be put to test experimentally, even sometimes to the point of underselling the theory. I have, then, no objection whatsoever to the experimental testing of hypotheses, wherever possible. By which last I mean, however, quite definitely and unreservedly to say that it is not always possible. There is a further important aspect to this matter. This has nothing to do with what the experimental psychologist may or may not be able to achieve. It has to do with what experimental psychology itself represents emotionally or psychically to those who engage in it, and its meaning as a cultural and behavioural phenomenon of our time. In this context and this sense, my views are quite unequivocal. Here, I see the academic psychologist spearheading a movement towards a society and a way of life under which, despite the use of the term way of life, it will not be possible for our species to continue to exist. I am not here speaking of hydrogen bombs or biological warfare, though these are symptomatic. Of what I precisely mean, I've tried to say something in the chapter on the psychotic society. I cannot take time to enlarge on this further here. I would, however, like to cite one more very small example of what is currently taking place at the heart, or the non-heart, of the civilized world. The incident which is described was reported in Newsweek magazine, 27th of July 1970. An American television company set up a fictitious emergency to ascertain whether allegations concerning certain medical ambulance services in America were well grounded. The subject of the drama were only acting. The ambulance men were real. He lay wreathing on the floor, a shabbily dressed middle-aged man, his eyes closed in pain, his mouth sucking desperately for air. Impassively, the ambulance driver and the attendant who had been summoned looked on. "He's got to have at least $38 or we don't take him," one of them snapped to the stricken man's roommate. Pointing to two $1 bills on the kitchen table, the roommate pleaded, That's all I can find. But he's got a job. He's good for the money." But this was not good enough for the Mid-America Ambulance Company. Visibly annoyed, the attendants helped the roommate prop the victim in a kitchen chair. Then they departed, but not before one of them pocketed the $2 from the table. It is likely that such an incident can take place in isolation from the fabric of society, or that such attitudes can... Sorry, let me read that again. Is it likely that such an incident can take place in isolation from the fabric of society, or that such attitudes can grow up overnight? Would one not be inclined to suspect that such incidents and attitudes might tend to be typical, to be symptomatic of a general mode of behaviour, of no less than a way of life? I have the feeling that some of my readers and former colleagues will take me to task for introducing human values in the wider context into what purports to be a scientific or objective examination of the personality. To this, I would say only that I cannot for 1 minute imagine how any book on any scientific subject whatsoever could fail at some point to be concerned with human values. There are, after all, no other values. But I cannot conceive for a microsecond how any book on the social sciences could, essentially, be concerned with anything else. For if the social scientist is not to be the guardian of human values and the psychological health of the human community, then who, today, is? It is for the gross dereliction of this particular function I would here indict the academic psychologist. One cannot stand by in silence when the psychologist degenerates into a man whose sole function is to produce habits out of a rat. I have lastly been asked whether, as a consequence of my views on the structure of personality, I consider war between the races, between the gene pools, and war between the sexes as inevitable. One's first comment is that if a difference is in fact genetically and not merely culturally produced, it cannot, whatever else, be wished away or otherwise treated as if it did not exist. One sees such differences then as irreducible in the absolute sense. It is just as well that this is so, for it seems clear that the new emerges continually, and perhaps only, from the meetings of differences, that is, from thesis meeting antithesis. To say, however, that these phenomena are irreducible is not actually to say that they are unmodifiable or their expression incapable of any control. The first indispensable step in control, nevertheless, must be the identification and precise understanding of the phenomenon. To this end, the present book is offered as a contribution. Already, in such a process of description, means of control or remedy suggest themselves. However, I dislike the overtones of the word control, and remedy suggests a disease or illness. I prefer some such word as channeling. At all events, this control or channeling must in no sense be understood to imply any kind of manipulation of one group by another. I do not, then, even if it were possible, wish for uniformity. Neither, on the other hand, do I wish for competition in the usual sense of that word. Competitive interaction, despite conservative views on the matter, is in essence and by nature negative and destructive. That is to say, any initial credit balance will in the long run always be offset by a larger, though perhaps invisible, deficit. The interaction of differences, which is what I am speaking of, need, however, not necessarily be harmful. To repeat an earlier remark, it seems to me, whatever else, that to believe that the behavioural and psychological differences between men and women, and to a lesser extent the behavioural and psychological differences between races and varieties of man, are not in the least partly genetically based, it is to be wholly naive. It goes without saying, of course, that different means neither superior nor inferior. Leaving with this matters on which others have commented or may comment. If there is one matter on which I would take myself to task, it is on having concentrated too much on the more easily grasped and too little on the less readily grasped. I have, that is, a sense of having made rather a contribution to System A and Knowledge 1, which does not urgently require support, than to System B and Knowledge 2, which does. One comforts oneself to an extent with the thought that had one written a treatise solely with reference to, say, the I Ching, no social scientist would have bothered to read it. Ideally, of course, any contribution should be neither to System A nor System B, but to System C. In conclusion, I would like it to go on record that I am very aware of many significant contributions to the understanding of personality that I have not even found space to mention. Some would run counter to my own views, others are supportive. Contributions for which I have considerable respect include those of some experimentalists, C.L. Hull, D.O. Hebb, and others. My excuse for omissions, apart from the fact that cognitive theories at least already receive adequate attention from our cognitive society, is the limitations imposed by space, in turn imposed by the desire to present my views in the compass of a single volume. I hope to remedy at least some of the omissions in a later volume. In connection with the work of current social scientists, I would like to make one point and to draw one last distinction between the bulk of that work and my own. I suggest that the majority are horizontal, two-dimensional studies of the organism, while the present and those of Freud, Jung and some others are vertical studies. Ideally, three-dimensional, but in fact perhaps also at least sometimes two-dimensional, though then still in respect of the vertical, not the horizontal axis. The essential flatness of the academic and experimental approaches are perhaps glimpsed in the fact that some experimentalists' idea of a depth interview is one which lasts an hour instead of 10 minutes. I believe, as a generalization, that the horizontal or lateral approach arises apart from the question of one's own individual constitutional learning and out of a fear and a denial of the unconscious. The two-dimensional or vertical approach, such as I believe Freud's to be, arises perhaps also from a constitutional predisposition and again from a fear. But on this occasion of the annihilating Medusa eye of consciousness. There you go. So, we're going to wrap up really soon. Just see what's happening in the chat quickly. The only way out is in Ment System A society. And then Snowy wants to talk about his faults, Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, obviously. Yeah, you should talk to whoever you can about it. I'll chat with you at some point if you're up for it. Veltgeist Subverde would be happy to talk, Snowy. Okay, well that's it. So that's the end of Total Man. So we're going to take a break and come back after the new year. So with that said, everybody have a good Christmas and a good break and all the rest of it, and we'll catch up again in the new year. So keep looking out for stuff on the networks and all that about the next reading, and I'll catch up with you lot then. Okay. Yeah, Ralph. Yeah, 23 episodes. Yeah. Okay, so goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming along. And yeah, see you in a couple of weeks' time, I suppose. Where's the outro?